In the sweltering heat of a Guangdong summer in 1837, a failed scholar collapsed in his family courtyard, his body racked by fever, his mind consumed by visions that would shake an empire to its foundations. For 40 days and nights, Hong Xiuquan lay suspended between life and death, journeying through realms that no mortal eyes had witnessed. When he finally awoke, the man who emerged bore little resemblance to the dejected examination candidate who had fallen. His eyes blazed with divine certainty, his voice carried celestial authority, and his mind burned with revelations that would transform him from village nobody into the most dangerous man in China. This is the story of the Taiping Rebellion, how religious visions became revolutionary fire, how peasant grievances became cosmic war, and how the dream of establishing heaven on earth would unleash humanity's deadliest civil conflict across the Middle Kingdom. The fever came without warning on a sweltering summer day in 1837, striking down a failed scholar as he walked the dusty streets of his village in Guangdong province. Xiuquan collapsed in the courtyard of his family compound, his body convulsing as villagers gathered around his motionless form. For 40 days and 40 nights, he lay suspended between life and death, his physical form racked with illness, while his spirit journeyed through realms beyond mortal comprehension. When consciousness finally returned, the man who awoke bore little resemblance to the dejected examination candidate who had fallen. His eyes blazed with divine certainty, his voice carried the weight of celestial command, and his mind burned with visions that would reshape the destiny of the Middle Kingdom. The failed scholar knew with absolute conviction who he was, the younger brother of Jesus Christ, chosen by God to purge the empire of demons and establish the Taiping kingdom on earth. The realm into which this revelation erupted was a civilization trembling on the edge of catastrophe. The Qing dynasty, ruled by Manchu foreigners who had conquered the Han people nearly 2 centuries earlier, faced challenges that would have tested even the wisest emperors. Population had exploded from 150 million souls to over 430 million by mid-century, straining every resource while creating massive armies of landless peasants who wandered the countryside seeking survival. The ancient agricultural system that had sustained civilization for millennia buckled under pressures it was never designed to bear. The devastating aftermath of the First Opium War had torn away the last vestiges of imperial prestige. British gunboats had humiliated the Dragon Throne, forcing the Son of Heaven to accept unequal treaties that opened ports to foreign merchants and surrendered territories to barbarian rule. Massive indemnity payments drained the treasury, while foreign goods flooded markets, destroying local industries and leaving countless craftsmen destitute. The mandate of heaven itself seemed forfeit, as natural disasters ravaged provinces already groaning under taxation and social upheaval. Into this world of crisis had been born the future prophet, third son of a Hakka farming family in the hills of Guangdong. The Hakka people occupied a peculiar position in imperial life, ethnically Han but culturally distinct, speaking their own dialect and maintaining customs that set them apart from their neighbors. They had migrated south centuries earlier, claiming marginal lands in mountainous regions where they developed a fierce independence and warrior spirit that would serve them well in the trials ahead. The boy's childhood unfolded in the cramped confines of a farmhouse, where 3 generations crowded under a single roof. His grandfather had achieved modest prosperity through careful management of the family's small plot and shrewd trading in local markets. The old man possessed the driving ambition that would later consume his grandson, an unshakable belief that their lineage was destined for greatness despite humble circumstances. Education represented the pathway to advancement in Confucian civilization, where mastery of classical texts could elevate even the poorest peasant to the ranks of the scholar bureaucracy. The family scraped together every spare coin to pay for schooling, sacrificing their own comfort to fund their son's pursuit of literary achievement. The village schoolmaster, a failed candidate himself, recognized unusual intelligence in the serious boy who absorbed classical poetry and philosophical treatises with remarkable facility. The young man's academic prowess became legendary throughout the district. He composed poetry that moved grown men to tears, crafted essays that demonstrated profound understanding of ancient principles, and displayed the kind of literary brilliance that customarily marked future mandarins. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones of the prodigy, who would surely bring honor to his family and village through success in the imperial examinations. The examination system represented both the glory and the curse of imperial civilization. These competitive tests, administered at county, provincial, and imperial levels, theoretically offered every male subject the opportunity to serve the emperor through demonstrated merit rather than inherited privilege. Thousands of candidates competed for a handful of positions, with success bringing not only personal advancement but elevated status for entire families and communities. The reality proved far more brutal than the ideals suggested. Examinations demanded perfect mastery of an enormous corpus of classical literature, flawless calligraphy, and the ability to compose poetry and essays according to rigid stylistic conventions. Candidates spent decades memorizing texts written centuries earlier, training their minds to think in patterns established by ancient sages, while contemporary problems demanded innovative solutions. Xiuquan first attempted the county-level examinations in his 24th year, traveling to Guangzhou with the confidence of a young man whose intellectual gifts had never been seriously tested. The examination halls that greeted him resembled a cross between monastery and prison, with thousands of individual cells where candidates spent 3 days and 2 nights demonstrating their worthiness for government service. The experience proved devastating to a village prodigy unaccustomed to competition with the empire's finest minds. Failure struck like a physical blow. The young scholar returned home in shame, his dreams of advancement shattered by the realization that brilliance meant nothing when measured against impossibly high standards. The neighbors who had expected celebration instead witnessed humiliation, while his family struggled to maintain dignity despite their crushing disappointment. The man who had seemed destined for greatness found himself condemned to the life of a village schoolteacher, drilling children in the same classics that had failed to secure his own advancement. 3 more attempts over the next decade brought 3 more failures, each more devastating than the last. Confidence eroded with every rejection as he watched lesser men achieve the success that eluded him. The examination system that promised meritocracy instead revealed itself as an engine of systematic humiliation, breaking the spirits of countless talented individuals whose crime was failing to conform to ancient patterns of thought and expression. Between his 2nd and 3rd examination failures, the future prophet encountered materials that would transform not only his own destiny, but the fate of millions. During a trip to Guangzhou, he received a collection of missionary tracts from Liang Fa, a convert who distributed literature outside the examination halls. The pamphlets bore the innocuous title, "Good Words to Admonish the Age," but their contents contained revolutionary ideas that would shatter his worldview completely. The foreign faith had first reached the empire through Jesuit missionaries during the Ming dynasty, but the alien creed had made little impact on a civilization supremely confident in its own cultural superiority. The Qing had expelled most missionaries and banned practice of the foreign religion, driving the faith underground, where it survived among small communities of converts who risked severe punishment for their beliefs. Protestant missionaries had only recently returned, arriving in the wake of the Opium War, to find a realm newly opened to foreign influence. Liang Fa's tracts presented doctrine through local cultural filters, emphasizing themes that resonated with established values while challenging fundamental assumptions about power and social order. The concept of a single, universal God who created all peoples and demanded moral behavior from rulers as well as subjects offered a radical alternative to the hierarchical cosmology that supported imperial rule. More subversive still was the notion that salvation came through faith rather than ritual compliance, undermining the entire Confucian system of moral cultivation. The scholar initially dismissed these foreign ideas as irrelevant to his immediate concerns. The tracts gathered dust in his study while he focused on preparing for his next examination attempt, memorizing classical passages and perfecting his calligraphy according to established methods. Only after his final failure did he return to the materials, seeking solace in their promise of justice and eternal reward for the righteous. The fevered illness that struck him immediately after this last examination failure created the perfect conditions for psychological transformation. Physical weakness, emotional devastation, and spiritual hunger combined to make his mind extraordinarily receptive to new ideas and experiences. The concepts he had absorbed months earlier began merging with elements from folk religion, Taoist mysticism, and his own psychological needs to create a unique theological system. During his 40-day delirium, the prophet experienced visions of unprecedented clarity and detail. An elderly man with golden beard and magnificent robes welcomed him to a celestial palace where demons were being systematically destroyed by armies of warriors. This figure, whom he immediately recognized as the creator described in the missionary tracts, commanded him to descend to earth and complete the work of purification that his elder brother Jesus had begun among the foreign nations. The middle-aged man who appeared beside the creator possessed a familiar face that he initially could not place. Only when this figure spoke did recognition dawn. This was Jesus Christ himself, the elder brother he had read about in Liang Fa's pamphlets. But Christ spoke to him not as a foreign deity addressing a distant convert, but as an elder sibling welcoming a younger brother into the family business of salvation. The mission that had begun in Palestine would continue in the Middle Kingdom under his leadership. These visions provided the prophet with a complete theological framework that resolved every contradiction between his cultural background and foreign insights. The creator was not an alien god, but the supreme deity whom sages had dimly perceived through natural reason. Confucius, Buddha, and Laozi had been servants of this universal God, but their teachings had been corrupted by later interpreters who had transformed wisdom into elaborate systems of ritual and philosophical speculation. The Manchu ruling class emerged in his revised theology as literal demons who had usurped power and plunged the realm into spiritual darkness. Their queue, hairstyle, distinctive clothing, and foreign customs marked them as agents of Satan who had deceived the people into abandoning their true allegiance to the Creator. The examination system that had rejected him represented not legitimate governance, but demonic manipulation, designed to prevent true wisdom from challenging false rule. Recovery from his illness brought immediate changes that shocked his family and neighbors. The man who had been a model Confucian scholar began denouncing the very texts he had spent decades mastering. Classical poetry gave way to hymns, while philosophical speculation was replaced by prophetic declarations about the approaching kingdom. Most disturbing of all, he began destroying Confucian tablets and ancestral shrines, claiming that such objects housed demons who had been deceiving the people for centuries. The transformation extended beyond belief to encompass his entire understanding of social relationships and political power. Imperial culture emphasized harmony through hierarchy, with every individual occupying a fixed position in cosmic and social order. His theology proclaimed radical equality before the Creator, who judged all people according to moral behavior rather than social status. Rich and poor, noble and commoner, Han and Manchu, all stood equal before judgment. This egalitarian theology carried explosive political implications in a realm organized around hereditary privilege and ethnic hierarchy. If the Creator truly made no distinction between peoples, then Manchu claims to rule over Han. Populations had no sanction. If moral behavior rather than ritual compliance determined salvation, then the entire edifice of imperial power based on Confucian orthodoxy crumbled. The prophet's vision inherently challenged every fundamental assumption supporting Qing dynasty rule. Yet his initial efforts to share revelations met with skepticism and hostility from family members who feared the consequences of such radical ideas. His father had invested everything in his son's conventional success and watched in horror as those investments turned to nothing. His brothers worried that enthusiasm would bring disaster on the entire family, while neighbors whispered about madness and possession by evil spirits. The breakthrough came when he encountered Feng Yunshan, a fellow Hakka and failed examination candidate who possessed the organizational skills that the prophet himself lacked. Where the visionary was driven by passion, Feng was a practical organizer who understood how to translate inspiring ideas into effective action. Their partnership would prove crucial to transforming personal revelation into mass movement. Feng had known the prophet since childhood and witnessed his academic brilliance firsthand. Unlike others who dismissed the transformation as madness, Feng recognized the profound theological insights that emerged from his friend's fevered visions. More importantly, Feng possessed the political acumen to understand how these ideas could address the practical grievances that tormented millions of peasants. The two friends began traveling throughout Guangxi province, spreading the gospel to Hakka communities that had been marginalized by mainstream imperial culture. These mountain people, struggling to survive on poor land while facing discrimination from their Han neighbors, proved remarkably receptive to a message that promised justice and earthly transformation. The preaching drew on deep wells of resentment against a system that relegated hard-working people to permanent inferiority. The Hakka communities of Guangxi had been locked in increasingly violent conflicts with their Punti neighbors for decades. Competition for land, water rights, and commercial opportunities had generated feuds that claimed thousands of lives while government officials provided little protection for either side. These ethnic tensions created a pool of experienced fighters who possessed both military skills and powerful motivation to challenge existing power. The prophet's theological innovations proved perfectly suited to this environment of cultural conflict and economic desperation. His proclamation that the Creator valued all peoples equally resonated powerfully with Hakka audiences who had been told for generations that their dialect, customs, and origins marked them as inferior. The promise of a coming kingdom where the first would be last and the last would be first offered hope to communities that imperial culture had written off as irrelevant. More practically, the denunciation of Confucian orthodoxy and Manchu rule provided theological justification for the violence that many Hakka communities already considered inevitable. If the current government truly represented demonic power rather than legitimate rule, then resistance became a duty rather than criminal rebellion. The same fighting skills that Hakka men had developed in conflicts with Punti neighbors could be redirected toward the holy war that the prophet proclaimed. The God-worshipping movement that emerged from these early preaching efforts represented something genuinely new in imperial life. Unlike secret organizations that maintained elaborate hierarchies and mysterious rituals, the prophet's organization emphasized direct relationships between individual believers and the Creator. Members abandoned established practices in favor of worship that featured communal prayer, hymn singing, and public confession of sins. The movement's social practices proved even more revolutionary than its theological innovations. The prophet proclaimed absolute equality between men and women, a radical departure from Confucian traditions that relegated females to permanent subordination. Women could preach, lead prayers, and hold positions of leadership within the organization. Most shocking of all, he banned the practice of foot binding, declaring that the Creator had made women's feet to serve practical purposes rather than aesthetic ideals. Sexual relationships received equally revolutionary treatment under his theological system. The movement prohibited prostitution, concubinage, and adultery, while establishing strict moral codes that applied equally to both sexes. Marriage became a sacred covenant between equal partners, rather than a commercial transaction between families. These reforms appealed powerfully to women who had suffered under established arrangements while attracting men who were tired of the sexual exploitation that characterized conventional culture. Economic practices within the God-worshipping movement reflected the same egalitarian principles that governed social relationships. Members contributed property and labor to common funds that supported the organization's activities while providing security for individuals in times of need. This proto-communist system eliminated the desperate competition for resources that characterized peasant life, while creating powerful incentives for loyalty and cooperation. The movement's approach to education broke completely with Confucian traditions that emphasized memorization of ancient texts. Instead of drilling students in classical literature, God-worshipping teachers focused on practical literacy that enabled ordinary people to read scriptures and understand the prophet's theological writings. This educational revolution created a cadre of literate peasants who possessed both enthusiasm and the intellectual tools necessary for effective organization. Military training became an integral component of movement activities as the prophet's theological vision evolved to encompass the violent overthrow of demonic power. Members learned to use weapons while developing the discipline and coordination necessary for effective combat. Most importantly, they absorbed the psychological preparation required to kill and die for principles, transforming ordinary farmers and craftsmen into holy warriors ready to sacrifice everything for the kingdom. By the mid-1840s, a decade after the prophet's initial visions, the God-worshipping movement had grown from a handful of believers into an organization encompassing tens of thousands of committed followers throughout Guangxi province. These converts had abandoned established practices, rejected government oversight, and organized themselves into a parallel structure that operated according to radically different principles from those governing the world around them. The growth of this movement occurred against a backdrop of escalating crisis throughout the Qing Empire. The massive rebellion that would soon engulf the realm was still years in the future, but the conditions that would make such an explosion possible were already clearly visible. Government finances strained under the burden of Opium War indemnities, while corruption hollowed out imperial administration. Natural disasters struck province after province, generating refugees who wandered the countryside seeking survival while challenging local officials' capacity to maintain order. The Yellow River had been shifting its course for decades as accumulated silt raised the riverbed above surrounding terrain. Massive floods displaced millions of people while destroying agricultural infrastructure that had supported stable communities for centuries. These environmental refugees, desperate and angry, provided perfect recruits for any movement that promised radical change. Ethnic tensions that had simmered throughout southern regions for generations began erupting into open warfare as competition for dwindling resources intensified. Hakka and Punti communities that had previously managed to coexist despite their differences now found themselves locked in struggles for survival, where compromise seemed impossible. Government officials, overwhelmed by the scale of violence and lacking resources to maintain order, often made conflicts worse through clumsy interventions that favored one side over another. Criminal organizations flourished in this environment of weakened oversight and social chaos. Secret groups that had operated in the shadows now controlled entire districts, collecting taxes, maintaining courts, and providing security services that government officials could no longer deliver. Some of these organizations maintained established orientations focused on mutual protection and commercial advantage, while others adopted increasingly revolutionary agendas that challenged the foundations of imperial rule. The Qing military forces, responsible for maintaining order, proved inadequate to the challenges they faced. The banner armies that had conquered the realm 2 centuries earlier had degenerated into a hereditary caste, more concerned with preserving privileges than fighting enemies. The Green Standard Army, composed of Han soldiers under Manchu officers, possessed neither the training nor the motivation necessary for effective counterinsurgency operations. Local militias, organized by gentry families, provided some security for their immediate areas, but lacked the coordination and resources needed to address regional problems. Into this landscape of systemic crisis, the Prophets movement introduced elements that would transform local unrest into universal revolution. The God-worshipping organization possessed theological justifications for total war against existing power, organizational structures capable of sustained resistance, and leadership that combined passion with practical competence. Most dangerously from the government's perspective, the movement offered ordinary people a vision of radical transformation that addressed their deepest grievances while promising rewards that established order could never provide. The stage was set for an explosion that would shake the foundations of civilization. The Prophet had spent a decade transforming personal revelation into mass movement, while Feng Yunshan had created organizational structures capable of sustaining prolonged conflict. Tens of thousands of believers throughout Guangxi province waited for the signal that would launch their holy war against demonic power. The forces that would soon engulf the Middle Kingdom in the bloodiest civil war in human history had gathered their strength and prepared their weapons. The fever that had struck an obscure, failed scholar in a Guangdong village had generated visions that would reshape the destiny of hundreds of millions. The younger brother of Jesus Christ had received his commission and assembled an army of believers ready to establish the kingdom on earth. The time for preaching and preparation was nearly over. The age of holy war was about to begin. Transformation began in the mountains of Guangxi, where mist clung to ancient peaks and valleys echoed with the sound of rushing streams. Here, in villages that seemed forgotten by the outside world, Feng Yunshan worked his quiet revolution. While his prophet friend retreated to study theological doctrines and compose sacred texts, this most trusted lieutenant moved among Hakka settlements like a master craftsman, building machinery that would soon shake an empire to its foundations. Yunshan possessed gifts that complemented his friend's visionary brilliance perfectly. Where the prophet inspired through revelation and spiritual fire, Yunshan organized through patient calculation and systematic planning. He understood that transforming a spiritual awakening into an effective fighting force required more than passionate converts. It demanded discipline, structure, and institutional frameworks capable of sustaining themselves through years of warfare and persecution. God-worshipping communities that emerged under Yunshan's guidance represented something unprecedented in imperial history. These were not loose collections of believers united only by shared enthusiasm, but carefully organized cells operating according to detailed protocols that governed every aspect of daily life. Members rose before dawn for communal prayers, spent their days in productive labor benefiting entire groups, and gathered each evening for instruction in both theological principles and practical skills. Military structure that Yunshan created drew inspiration from ancient texts describing Zhou dynasty armies, but adapted these classical models to contemporary realities and revolutionary purposes. Basic units consisted of 25 families, grouped into a liang, with 5 liang forming a shi and 5 shui comprising a jun. This hierarchical system enabled rapid communication and coordination, while ensuring that every individual understood their role within larger organizations. Leadership positions within this structure were awarded based on demonstrated competence, an unwavering commitment to principles rather than birth or wealth. A charcoal burner who showed exceptional courage might find himself commanding hundreds of followers, while a merchant's son who wavered in dedication could be reduced to common ranks. This meritocratic approach attracted ambitious individuals who had been blocked from advancement by rigid imperial hierarchies. Revolutionary approaches to gender roles within God-worshipping communities scandalized conventional observers, while attracting enormous support from women who had spent their lives under Confucian restrictions. Female believers could hold leadership positions, bear arms, and participate in all activities on equal terms with men. Witnessing women drilling with spears and swords beside their male comrades suggested complete inversion of established social order that terrified government officials. Foot-binding practices, that ancient symbol of female subordination, became particular targets of reformers. Women who joined God-worshippers were required to unbind their feet and return them to natural condition, regardless of age or previous conditioning. Physical pain involved in this process was often excruciating, but converts endured it willingly as symbols of their liberation from demonic customs. These big-footed women became walking advertisements for revolutionary ideology. Economic arrangements within God-worshipping communities implemented radical redistribution that their prophet had preached in theoretical terms. Private property was abolished in favor of communal systems where all resources belonged to groups collectively. Families contributed their possessions to common treasuries, while receiving food, clothing, and shelter according to need rather than ability to pay. This primitive socialism eliminated desperate poverty that had driven many to join, while creating powerful incentives for group loyalty. Educational programs that Yunshan established broke completely with conventional approaches to learning and literacy. Instead of forcing students to memorize classical texts in archaic language, God-worshipping schools taught practical reading and writing using simplified characters and contemporary vocabulary. Men and women of all ages learned together, studying religious texts alongside basic mathematics, geography, and technical skills that would prove useful in struggles ahead. Most revolutionary of all was integration of military training into daily routine throughout God-worshipping communities. Every able-bodied member, regardless of age or gender, learned to handle weapons and execute basic tactical maneuvers. Morning exercises that appeared to be simple calisthenics were actually drills designed to build physical conditioning and coordination necessary for effective combat. Evening gatherings that seemed focused on spiritual instruction included detailed lessons in battlefield tactics and strategic thinking. Weapons training that these communities provided went far beyond simple familiarity with arms. Instructors who had gained experience in clan feuds and bandit conflicts taught advanced techniques for individual combat, small unit operations, and siege warfare. Members learned to construct and use crossbows, fire lances, and primitive cannons alongside conventional swords and spears. Most importantly, they absorbed psychological preparation necessary to kill and die for their beliefs without hesitation. As word of these extraordinary communities spread throughout Guangxi province, they attracted attention from desperate people seeking alternatives to misery and chaos that characterized their daily lives. Refugees from ethnic conflicts found security and purpose within God-worshipping settlements. Peasants crushed by taxation and natural disasters discovered economic arrangements that guaranteed survival regardless of individual circumstances. Women trapped in oppressive marriages or sold into concubinage escaped to organizations that treated them as equals rather than property. Growth during these crucial years followed patterns that maximized both security and effectiveness. New recruits underwent intensive screening to identify government spies and unreliable individuals who might compromise operational security. Those accepted into organizations participated in elaborate initiation ceremonies that combined religious symbolism with binding oaths of loyalty. Psychological impact of these rituals created powerful emotional bonds that helped sustain commitment through trials ahead. Intelligence networks that Xiuquan established provided God-worshipping leaders with detailed information about government activities, rival organizations, and potential threats throughout regions. Merchants sympathetic to causes carried messages between scattered communities, while gathering intelligence about conditions in distant areas. Women working as servants in government offices and wealthy households reported on conversations and documents that revealed official plans and capabilities. Financial resources that sustained this growing organization came from diverse sources, reflecting both broad appeal and leaders' practical intelligence. Wealthy converts contributed substantial funds when they joined, while ongoing collections from community members provided steady income for daily operations. More controversially, groups began extracting taxes from non-believers in areas where God-worshippers had achieved numerical dominance, effectively challenging government fiscal monopolies. Criminal activities also supplemented resources, though these operations were carefully planned to avoid unnecessary provocations that might trigger premature government retaliation. Raids on government treasuries and merchant caravans provided funds and supplies, while demonstrating capabilities to potential recruits. These attacks were always justified in theological terms as righteous seizure of wealth that demons had stolen from people. Local government officials initially dismissed reports about God-worshipping activities as exaggerated accounts of typical peasant unrest. Qing administrative systems were accustomed to dealing with secret societies, spiritual awakenings, and ethnic conflicts through combinations of limited military action and political accommodation. Most such disturbances burned themselves out within months when faced with determined resistance, while their leaders could often be bought off through offers of minor positions or financial incentives. First serious clashes between God-worshippers and imperial forces occurred when local magistrates attempted to arrest leaders for tax evasion and illegal assembly. Officials expected to find a handful of fanatics who would scatter when confronted by armed troops. Instead, they encountered disciplined fighters who had prepared extensively for exactly this confrontation. Government forces retreated in disorder after suffering casualties they had never anticipated facing from mere peasants. This initial victory demonstrated both military capabilities and government's fundamental misunderstanding of what they faced. News of clashes spread rapidly throughout Guangxi province, attracting new recruits while alerting officials that they confronted something far more dangerous than routine civil unrest. Psychological impact proved as significant as immediate military consequences, convincing many observers that god worshippers possessed supernatural protection that made them invincible in battle. Escalation that followed this first confrontation revealed inherent logic that would drive conflict toward total war. Government officials could not afford to ignore armed resistance to their commands, while god-worshipping leaders understood that any compromise would undermine their credibility and leave them vulnerable to destruction. Each side possessed powerful incentives to increase pressure on opponents, creating spirals of violence that neither could easily control. Imperial forces that arrived to suppress rebellions found themselves facing enemies who employed tactics and organizational methods unlike anything in their previous experience. Traditional approaches to counterinsurgency assumed that rebels would fight conventional battles, where superior training and equipment provided decisive advantages. God worshippers instead employed guerrilla warfare that exploited their intimate knowledge of local terrain while avoiding confrontations that favored government strengths. Harsh measures that frustrated officials employed in response to these tactical disadvantages only strengthened movements by validating theological claims about demonic persecution. Villages suspected of harboring god worshippers were burned and their inhabitants massacred, regardless of actual involvement in organizations. These atrocities generated enormous resentment among previously neutral populations, while providing powerful propaganda that recruiters used to attract new converts. Young Xiuqan emerged during this period of escalating conflict as their most effective military commander. Unlike their prophet, whose influence derived from spiritual revelation, or Yunshan, whose power came from organizational skill, Yang possessed charismatic leadership and tactical genius necessary for large-scale warfare. His ability to inspire troops under desperate circumstances and devise innovative solutions to seemingly impossible problems made him indispensable to survival. Wei Changhui brought different but equally crucial capabilities to leadership groups forming around prophets. His background in commercial activities had provided him with networks throughout southern regions that proved invaluable for intelligence gathering and resource acquisition. More importantly, Wei possessed ruthless pragmatism necessary for making difficult decisions about resource allocation, personnel management, and strategic priorities that idealistic leaders often struggled to address effectively. Shidakai represented appeal to educated elites who had become disillusioned with imperial administration and Confucian orthodoxy. His literary accomplishments and philosophical sophistication provided intellectual credibility that helped attract scholars and officials who might otherwise have dismissed god worshippers as ignorant fanatics. Xi's presence within leadership groups demonstrated that organizations offered opportunities for advancement to talented individuals regardless of their social background. Theological innovations that prophets continued developing during this period of military conflict provided frameworks for understanding warfare in spiritual terms that motivated extraordinary sacrifice and commitment. Battles were not mere political struggles, but cosmic confrontations between forces of good and evil. God-worshipping fighters who died in combat were assured of immediate entry into paradise, while enemies who opposed them faced eternal damnation regardless of their personal character or intentions. This theological framework enabled organizations to maintain morale, despite suffering casualties that would have destroyed conventional groups. Parents willingly sent their children into battle, knowing they might never return, while fighters advanced against overwhelming odds, because they believed divine intervention would ensure victory for righteous causes. Psychological advantages that these beliefs provided proved as important as any material resources in sustaining organizations through their most difficult periods. Administrative structures that Xiuquan and his colleagues developed during these years of guerrilla warfare anticipated challenges they would face when governing large territories and diverse populations. Detailed regulations specified how captured cities should be administered, how resources should be distributed, and how justice should be dispensed according to principles. These preparations demonstrated remarkable foresight about practical requirements of successful revolution. Treatment of prisoners and civilian populations in areas under God, worshipping control reflected complex blends of humanitarian idealism and military necessity. Captives who converted to theological systems were welcomed as brothers and sisters, regardless of their previous affiliations. Those who refused to abandon their beliefs faced ranges of punishments from confiscation of property to execution, depending on their perceived threats to security. Women captured during military operations received protection from sexual assault and other forms of abuse that commonly characterized warfare in this period. Female prisoners were assigned to work details alongside members rather than being treated as personal property of individual fighters. These policies reflected genuine commitment to gender equality while serving practical purposes by encouraging voluntary surrender and cooperation from civilian populations. Economic policies implemented in territories under control eliminated many abuses that had driven peasants to rebellion, while establishing systems that could sustain prolonged military operations. Taxation was reduced to levels that communities could actually afford, while corruption and embezzlement were punished by death, regardless of perpetrators' rank or connections. These reforms generated enormous popular support in areas where government administration had become synonymous with exploitation. Land redistribution programs attempted to implement egalitarian principles that formed cores of ideologies. Large estates were confiscated from wealthy owners and divided among landless peasants according to family size and productive capacity. These redistribution efforts faced enormous practical difficulties, but they demonstrated commitment to fundamental social transformation rather than merely political change. Spiritual practices in controlled areas underwent systematic transformation as God-worshipping theology replaced beliefs and customs. Temples dedicated to Buddhist and Taoist deities were converted to halls for worship of true gods, while Confucian shrines were destroyed as centers of demonic influence. These iconoclastic campaigns alienated some potential supporters, but reinforced identities as forces for complete spiritual renewal. Education systems established in liberated territories represented perhaps their most forward-looking innovation. Schools that had previously served only wealthy families were open to children of all social backgrounds, with particular emphasis on including girls who had been systematically excluded from formal learning. Curricula emphasized practical skills alongside basic literacy, preparing students for productive roles in transformed orders that organizations intended to create. By early 1850s, God-worshipping organizations had evolved from collections of spiritual communities into functioning states that controlled substantial territory and governed hundreds of thousands of people. This transformation required institutional developments that went far beyond anything original founders had envisioned when they began preaching in Guangxi villages. Organizations now possessed organizational capacity and popular support, necessary to challenge imperial rule directly. Decisions to proclaim Taiping. Heavenly kingdoms represented both logical culminations of developments that had been building for years and dramatic escalations that committed organizations to total victory or total destruction. There could be no return to previous status quo once prophets formally claimed imperial titles and announced their intentions to overthrow Qing dynasties entirely. Battle of Jintian marked symbolic beginnings of open rebellion, though armed conflict had been raging for months before this formal declaration of independence. Engagements themselves were relatively small compared to massive battles that would follow, but their political significance far exceeded their military importance. For first times, God worshippers publicly proclaimed their intentions to replace existing governments rather than merely seeking accommodation within established orders. Victory at Jintian demonstrated that imperial forces were unprepared for disciplined resistance they now faced. Troops that had expected to disperse fanatics with minimal effort instead encountered fighters who employed sophisticated tactics and displayed unwavering commitment to their causes. Psychological impact of this success attracted thousands of new recruits, while convincing many neutral observers that organizations possessed genuine potential for success. Proclamation ceremonies that accompanied Jintian victories established institutional frameworks that would govern Taiping, heavenly kingdoms, throughout their existence. Prophets assumed titles of heavenly kings, while their principal lieutenants received royal designations that reflected their contributions to successes. These hierarchical structures provided clear lines of command while satisfying ambitions of leaders who had risked everything for revolutionary causes. Transformation from spiritual awakening to political state created new challenges that would test leadership's ability to balance idealistic principles with practical necessities. Governing territory required compromises and accommodations that pure theology could not always justify, while military success demanded strategic decisions that sometimes conflicted with humanitarian ideals. Tensions inherent in these competing demands would shape kingdom development throughout their turbulent existence. As news of Taiping proclamations spread throughout empires, it triggered responses that revealed both government weakness and growing strength. Provincial officials who had dismissed reports about peasant unrest suddenly found themselves confronting well-organized rebellions that threatened dynasty survival. Ages of accommodation and limited response were ending. Times for total war had begun. Flames that had begun flickering in obscure Guangxi villages now blazed across southern regions, illuminating landscapes transformed by revolutionary fervor and millennial hope. Younger brothers of Jesus Christ had emerged from mountain strongholds to claim their earthly inheritance. Kingdoms of heaven were no longer distant promises, but immediate realities that challenged every assumption about power, faith, and human possibility. Greatest civil wars in human history were about to engulf middle kingdoms in blood and fire. Victory at Jintian had tasted of honey and iron, but Yang Xiuqan understood that celebration would prove premature without territorial expansion beyond their mountain strongholds. Standing amid the smoking ruins of government barracks, surveying captured weapons and liberated supplies, this brilliant tactician already envisioned campaigns that would carry their sacred banners across half of China. Guangxi province offered refuge and recruits, yet its mountainous terrain and sparse population could never sustain the massive military strength necessary for overthrowing an empire. Northward lay the prize that beckoned with irresistible allure, the fertile Yangtze River Valley, where rice paddies stretched to distant horizons, and ancient cities commanded wealth that dwarfed anything their impoverished homeland could provide. Here lived millions of Han peasants groaning under Manchu taxation, craftsmen whose skills had been sacrificed to foreign competition, and scholars whose talents rotted in a system that valued conformity over innovation. Most crucially, controlling these waterways would sever Beijing's lifeline to southern tribute that kept the dynasty financially viable. Preparation for this audacious advance required months of careful organization that tested every capability Feng Yunshan had developed during years of underground work. Scattered god-worshipping communities throughout Guangxi were consolidated into mobile columns, capable of sustained operations far from familiar territory. Weapons were distributed according to individual skills and tactical requirements, while supply trains were organized to carry everything from medical materials to siege equipment across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. Intelligence networks that had served them well during guerrilla operations now focused on gathering detailed information about enemy deployments, civilian attitudes, and geographic obstacles along their projected route. Merchants sympathetic to their cause provided maps and local knowledge that proved invaluable for planning river crossings, identifying supply sources, and avoiding unnecessary confrontations with superior forces. Women who had worked as servants in government compounds shared insights about official capabilities and weaknesses that would prove crucial in battles ahead. Morale preparation received equal attention as logistical planning, since success would require fighters to maintain discipline and commitment during a campaign that might last months or years. Daily assemblies reinforced theological teachings that justified their war while preparing warriors psychologically for hardships they would inevitably face. Hymns celebrating past victories blended with prayers for divine protection, creating emotional atmospheres that transformed ordinary peasants into holy warriors, ready to die for their beliefs. When columns finally began moving northward in early 1852, they represented military power unlike anything China had witnessed in centuries. These were not bandits seeking plunder or rebels pursuing limited political goals, but disciplined fighting formations dedicated to complete transformation of civilization itself. Men and women marched together in ranks that demonstrated their commitment to gender equality, while their banners proclaimed messages of liberation that resonated powerfully with oppressed populations throughout their path. Hunan province became their first major testing ground, where Qing defenders attempted to block further advance with troops that reflected everything wrong with imperial military organization. Banner soldiers dispatched from distant garrisons possessed neither local knowledge nor motivation necessary for effective counterinsurgency operations. Green Standard fighters drawn from Han populations showed little enthusiasm for defending a Manchu dynasty that had systematically excluded them from positions of real authority. Local militias, organized by gentry families, fought with desperate courage, but lacked coordination and resources needed to resist professional formations. Battle after battle demonstrated technological and tactical advantages that years of preparation had provided God-worshipping fighters, while government troops relied on antiquated formations and obsolete weapons. Revolutionary warriors employed innovative combinations of traditional arms with crude firearms that multiplied their effectiveness against conventional opponents. More importantly, their superior discipline and coordination enabled them to concentrate overwhelming power at decisive points while avoiding enemy strengths that might have proven dangerous. Siege warfare capabilities that had been developed through careful study of ancient texts and practical experimentation proved devastatingly effective against cities whose defenses had been designed for earlier eras. Portable artillery, constructed according to specifications, refined through years of trial and error, could breach walls that had protected communities for centuries. Assault techniques that integrated multiple approaches, direct attack, undermining, and psychological pressure, overwhelmed defenders who had expected to face traditional siege methods. Captured cities revealed the depth of popular resentment against Qing rule that had been building throughout decades of misgovernment and cultural oppression. Gates that had been barred against rebel armies opened when inhabitants realized these invaders offered liberation rather than conquest. Granaries that officials had emptied to prevent their capture proved unnecessary, since local populations willingly provided supplies to forces they viewed as deliverers from tyranny. Administrative innovations implemented in occupied territories demonstrated that Taiping leaders possessed not only military capabilities, but also governmental vision necessary for effective rule. Tax collection systems were reformed to eliminate the corruption and excessive demands that had impoverished rural communities. Justice was dispensed according to clear principles that applied equally to all social classes, replacing arbitrary decisions by corrupt magistrates. Most revolutionary of all, positions of local authority were awarded based on demonstrated competence rather than hereditary privilege or purchased office. Gender equality policies that had scandalized conservative observers in Guangxi proved even more shocking when implemented in sophisticated urban environments. Women who had spent their lives in seclusion found themselves encouraged to participate in public affairs, pursue education, and develop skills that Confucian tradition had deemed inappropriate for their sex. Female officials administered districts and commanded military units with authority that challenged fundamental assumptions about social organization throughout the Yangtze Valley. Religious transformation that accompanied political conquest swept away centuries of accumulated spiritual practices in favor of worship forms that emphasized direct relationships between individuals and their creator. Buddhist and Taoist temples were converted to meeting halls where communities gathered for prayers and instruction in revolutionary theology. Confucian academies became schools where children of all backgrounds learned practical skills alongside basic literacy, preparing them for productive roles in the transformed society their liberators intended to create. Economic policies implemented by Taiping administrators attempted to realize egalitarian ideals that had motivated their original uprising while addressing practical requirements of governing complex urban societies. Private ownership of land and major productive assets was abolished in favor of communal arrangements where resources belonged to entire communities rather than individual families. These radical redistributions faced enormous resistance from established elites, but they generated passionate support among landless peasants and urban workers who had been excluded from traditional prosperity. Population redistribution programs that had proven effective in smaller communities were scaled up to address demographic problems throughout occupied regions. Overcrowded areas were relieved through systematic relocation of surplus inhabitants to territories where their labor was most needed. These transfers, while often disruptive to established relationships, helped optimize resource utilization while breaking down local loyalties that might have supported counter-revolutionary activities. As revolutionary columns advanced deeper into Hunan and prepared for operations in neighboring provinces, they encountered resistance that tested their capabilities in new ways. Qing commanders who had survived initial defeats began adapting their tactics to exploit perceived weaknesses in god-worshipping units. Zheng Guofan, a scholar official whose literary accomplishments masked remarkable military genius, started organizing local militias according to principles that would eventually pose serious threats to rebel expansion. This emerging opposition differed fundamentally from conventional imperial defenders that had proven so ineffective against disciplined revolutionary formations. Instead of relying on hereditary soldiers motivated primarily by pay, these new units recruited fighters from local communities who possessed powerful incentives to defend their homes and families. Training emphasized practical skills rather than ceremonial displays, while leadership positions were awarded to men who demonstrated competence in actual combat rather than success in bureaucratic competition. Recognition that they faced increasingly formidable enemies only strengthened rebel determination to achieve decisive strategic objectives before their opponents could fully mobilize. Advance units pushed ahead with reckless speed, seeking to capture key objectives while government responses remained uncoordinated. This aggressive approach generated spectacular tactical successes, but also created vulnerabilities that more patient enemies might eventually exploit. Nanjing emerged as their ultimate prize, an ancient capital whose capture would provide both symbolic victory and practical advantages that could determine their campaign's outcome. This magnificent city commanded the Yangtze River at its most strategic point, controlling commerce that sustained much of southern China, while providing access to networks extending throughout the entire empire. More importantly, establishing their capital here would demonstrate to the world that they possessed governmental capabilities necessary for legitimate rule. Approaching Nanjing required careful coordination of multiple columns, advancing along different routes, while maintaining operational security that prevented defenders from concentrating their strength effectively. Intelligence gathered through merchant networks and sympathetic officials provided detailed information about defensive preparations, troop dispositions, and civilian attitudes that would influence their siege operations. Psychological warfare campaigns preceded actual military assault, encouraging desertion and surrender, while undermining morale among soldiers defending the city. When siege operations finally began, they demonstrated every lesson revolutionary fighters had learned during months of campaigning against fortified positions. Artillery positions were established at ranges that maximized destructive effect while minimizing exposure to counter-battery fire. Assault tunnels were dug according to engineering principles that had been refined through practical experience and theoretical study. Most importantly, multiple simultaneous attacks prevented defenders from concentrating their resources against any single threat. Civilian populations within Nanjing found themselves caught between conflicting pressures as siege operations intensified. Government officials demanded support for defensive efforts while threatening severe punishment for any cooperation with besieging rebels. Revolutionary propagandists promised liberation and prosperity to inhabitants who welcomed their arrival while warning of consequences for continued resistance. These competing appeals reflected broader struggles for legitimacy that would determine not only immediate military outcomes, but also long-term political viability. Breakthrough came when defenders' morale finally collapsed under pressures they could no longer sustain. Gates that had been sealed against assault opened from within, as inhabitants decided that accommodation offered better prospects than continued resistance. Streets that government forces had prepared for urban warfare instead witnessed celebrations as populations welcomed liberators they had learned to trust through months of consistent behavior. Transformation of Nanjing into Tianjin, heavenly capital, represented the culmination of achievements that had begun with obscure visions in a Guangdong village. Palaces that had housed Qing officials became administrative centers for revolutionary government, dedicated to implementing radical social transformation. Libraries that had preserved classical texts became repositories for new theological and political literature that challenged every assumption about proper social organization. Administrative structures established in their new capital reflected sophisticated understanding of governmental requirements that went far beyond anything their mountain communities had needed. 6 boards modeled on traditional imperial organization, but staffed with officials selected for competence rather than hereditary status, managed affairs ranging from finance and personnel to public works and justice. This bureaucratic apparatus demonstrated that revolutionary leaders possessed not only visionary ideals, but also practical capabilities necessary for effective governance. Northern Expedition, launched from their new capital base, represented perhaps the most audacious gamble in their remarkable campaign. Elite units were dispatched toward Beijing itself, seeking to eliminate Qing resistance through direct assault on imperial power centers, while their main strength consolidated control over territories they had already conquered. This dual strategy reflected confidence born of continuous victory, but it also divided their military strength in ways that might prove dangerous if enemies achieved greater coordination. Initial stages of this northern advance achieved successes that seemed to validate their optimistic assumptions about enemy weaknesses and their own invincibility. Cities fell with surprising ease as defenders fled rather than face fighters, whose reputation for military excellence had spread throughout the empire. Local populations provided supplies and intelligence that accelerated progress, while denying resources to government units attempting to organize effective resistance. Yet even as their banners advanced toward the imperial capital, careful observers could detect signs of trouble that might eventually threaten their remarkable achievements. Communication lines, extending over hundreds of miles, proved vulnerable to disruption by enemy units that employed guerrilla tactics copied from their own earlier operations. Supply requirements for columns operating far from their base areas strained logistical capabilities that had been adequate for more limited operations. More troubling still were emerging tensions within their leadership that reflected the stresses of governing territories, far larger and more complex than anything they had previously administered. Questions about resource allocation, strategic priorities, and personnel decisions generated disagreements that had been manageable during their uprising phase, but now threatened to undermine unity essential for continued success. Despite these emerging challenges, spring of 1853 found revolutionary commanders controlling territories that stretched from their Guangxi homeland to the approaches of Beijing itself. Millions of people lived under rebel administration that had abolished traditional social hierarchies while implementing radical reforms in gender relations, economic organization, and spiritual practice. Their capital at Tianjin housed governmental institutions capable of coordinating activities across this vast domain, while planning further expansion that might eventually encompass the entire empire. Standing on the walls of their heavenly capital, gazing across landscapes transformed by revolutionary fervor, rebel leaders could justifiably believe they stood on the verge of ultimate victory. Imperial defenders had proven incapable of stopping their advance, while populations throughout their conquered territories had embraced reforms that promised liberation from centuries of oppression. Their military strength remained undefeated, their treasury overflowed with captured wealth, and their cause attracted new supporters daily. Yet seeds of future troubles had already been planted in soil, fertilized by their very success. Governing vast territories required compromises with practical necessities that sometimes conflicted with idealistic principles. Managing complex urban societies demanded administrative skills that exceeded what mountain communities had needed. Most dangerously, success had bred confidence that might prove fatal when facing enemies who had learned from repeated defeats. Northern winds, carrying news of their victories, also brought whispers of gathering storm clouds that might soon threaten everything they had achieved. In the countryside beyond their control, new forms of resistance were emerging under leaders who understood both their strengths and their vulnerabilities. Time would reveal whether revolutionary zeal and military excellence could overcome the fundamental challenges that had destroyed every previous attempt to overthrow established authority in the Middle Kingdom. Success had soured like wine left too long in the sun. Young Xiuqan stood in the throne room of the Heavenly Palace at Tianjin, surrounded by captured treasures and ceremonial splendor that would have impressed any emperor. Yet his mind churned with calculations that had nothing to do with governing provinces or fighting Qing enemies. Power, that intoxicating drug that had drawn him from humble beginnings to command millions, now whispered seductive promises about possibilities that stretched far beyond his current position as Eastern King. Xiuqan possessed every gift necessary for battlefield command. Tactical brilliance that transformed desperate situations into stunning victories, charismatic presence that inspired absolute devotion from his followers, and ruthless pragmatism that enabled difficult decisions without emotional hesitation. Yet these same qualities that made him indispensable to the God-worshipping cause also generated ambitions that conflicted with the hierarchical structure their prophet had established when proclaiming the heavenly kingdom. 4 decades of continuous warfare had transformed the failed examination candidate from Guangxi into the most powerful man in half of China. His strategic decisions determined the fate of provinces. His tactical innovations shaped battles that killed thousands, and his administrative policies affected the daily lives of millions who lived under rebel rule. This accumulation of practical control created a dangerous divergence from the spiritual framework that supposedly governed their movement. The Heavenly King had retreated into contemplation and doctrinal refinement during the period when his kingdom expanded from mountain hideouts to continental dominion. While Xiuqan commanded expeditions and administered regions, their prophet spent his days composing poetry, revising texts, and receiving divine revelations that grew more elaborate, but less relevant to the practical challenges of governing a wartime state. This division of labor had proven effective during their expansion phase, when battlefield necessities demanded immediate decisions that awaited consultation with figures absorbed in spiritual matters. Xiuqan's genius had secured their territorial base, while the prophet's divine mandate provided the ideological foundation that justified their rebellion against established order. Yet success itself had created tensions that threatened to tear apart the command structure that had made their achievements possible. Friction began manifesting in seemingly minor disputes about ceremonial precedence and administrative oversight that masked deeper conflicts about the ultimate direction of their enterprise. Xiuqan insisted that warfare required centralized command structures that responded rapidly to changing circumstances, while the Heavenly King maintained that divine revelation provided the only legitimate source of guidance for decision-making. These competing approaches reflected fundamentally different visions about whether their kingdom should prioritize practical effectiveness or spiritual purity. Xiuqan's growing confidence in his own abilities led him to question not only specific policies, but the entire framework of divine mandate that had originally legitimized their rebellion. His battlefield successes had demonstrated that victory came through superior organization, innovative tactics, and inspirational guidance, rather than supernatural intervention or prophetic visions. This empirical approach to understanding their achievements inevitably undermined faith in otherworldly explanations that formed the core of their movement's identity. More dangerous still was Xiuqan's growing tendency to claim divine inspiration for his own decisions, gradually eroding the monopoly on heavenly communication that the prophet had enjoyed since his original visions. When Qing announced that God the Father himself had spoken directly to him about strategic matters, he crossed a spiritual line that challenged the fundamental basis of the Heavenly King's position. If multiple figures received divine revelations, then the prophet's role as the unique conduit for heavenly guidance became questionable. Wei Changhui watched these developments with the calculating eye of a man whose commercial background had taught him to recognize unstable partnerships before they collapsed into mutual destruction. His position as Northern King provided him with access to both men, while maintaining enough distance to avoid immediate entanglement in their growing rivalry. Yet neutrality became impossible as the conflict escalated from private disagreements to public confrontations that threatened the stability of their entire governmental structure. Xiuquan found himself torn between personal loyalty to comrades who had shared struggle and intellectual recognition that their crisis was undermining everything they had fought to achieve. His literary sophistication enabled him to understand the spiritual implications of Xiuqing's challenge to prophetic mandate, while his battlefield experience convinced him that internal divisions would prove fatal when facing more capable Qing opponents who were learning to exploit every weakness. The rank and file fighters who had followed these commanders through warfare remained largely unaware of the tensions developing within their command structure, but they sensed that something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere surrounding their cause. Victory celebrations that had once generated genuine enthusiasm now felt forced and artificial. Administrative decisions that had previously been implemented smoothly now provoked delays and confusion as competing hierarchies interfered with normal operations. Spiritual observances that had originally united communities in shared purpose became arenas for subtle political maneuvering as different factions sought to demonstrate their interpretation of proper doctrine. Sermons that had once focused on personal development and rebel solidarity now included veiled criticisms of unnamed figures whose faithfulness to divine guidance was allegedly questionable. These doctrinal disputes created uncertainty among believers who depended on clear guidance for psychological stability. Women who had achieved unprecedented opportunities for advancement within the rebel structure found themselves particularly vulnerable to the crisis, since their positions depended entirely on policies that might be reversed if interpretations shifted. Female commanders who had proven their capabilities in battle worried that power struggles might lead to restoration of traditional gender hierarchies that would eliminate their hard-won achievements. These fears created additional sources of tension within communities already strained by warfare demands and social transformation. Economic policies that had initially generated enthusiastic support began creating resentment as practical difficulties accumulated and idealistic promises failed to materialize. Communal ownership arrangements that had seemed liberating when first implemented proved difficult to manage efficiently, leading to shortages and inequitable distribution that undermined faith in rebel economics. Citizens who had expected immediate improvement in their material conditions grew frustrated when continued fighting, diverted resources from domestic improvements to battlefield necessities. Population redistribution programs that had originally been voluntary relied on coercion as administrators struggled to optimize resource allocation across their domains. Families that had willingly relocated during the expansion phase now resisted further moves that separated them from communities they had worked to establish. These enforcement challenges required administrative attention and armed resources that might have been devoted to more productive purposes if internal unity had been maintained. Educational innovations that had initially attracted widespread support began generating opposition from traditional families who worried that rebel curricula were undermining established cultural values. without providing adequate preparation for practical careers. Parents who had embraced gender equality in theory became concerned when their daughters expressed interest in combat service or administrative positions that exposed them to dangers previously reserved for men. These generational conflicts added social stress to communities already struggling with economic and political uncertainties. Meanwhile, Qing resistance was evolving in ways that posed serious threats to rebel domains. Zheng Guofan's organizational innovations had created local militias that possessed both the motivation and capabilities necessary for sustained resistance to God-worshipping control. These formations recruited fighters from communities that had direct stakes in defending their homes and families, generating commitment levels that professional soldiers rarely matched. Imperial commanders who had learned from early defeats were developing strategies specifically designed to exploit the vulnerabilities that success had created within rebel regions. Instead of attempting direct assaults against strongholds, they focused on disrupting supply lines, encouraging defections, and gradually isolating communities from sources of support. These patient approaches required fewer resources than major campaigns, while proving more effective at weakening rebel capabilities over time. Foreign observers who had initially been impressed by rebel effectiveness were beginning to recognize signs of internal weakness that suggested their apparent strength might prove temporary. Diplomatic reports flowing back to European capitals noted evidence of command disputes, administrative confusion, and declining morale among populations that had originally welcomed rebel rule. These assessments influenced foreign policy decisions that would prove crucial as the conflict evolved. The crisis that had been building for months finally erupted when Xu Qing's challenge to prophetic mandate became too explicit to ignore or accommodate. His announcement that he had received direct revelations from God, the Father, commanding him to assume supreme control of the heavenly kingdom, represented a spiritual coup attempt that forced the prophet to respond decisively or risk losing all credibility among their followers. The prophet's response revealed both the depths of his paranoia and the extent to which practical governance had become secondary to maintaining his personal position. Rather than attempting to resolve the dispute through negotiation or doctrinal debate, he chose to eliminate the challenge through violence that would shock even veterans accustomed to the brutalities of warfare. The orders he issued to Wei Changhui demonstrated that survival instincts had completely overwhelmed the humanitarian ideals that had originally motivated their movement. Wei Changhui's acceptance of these assassination orders reflected his calculation that supporting the prophet offered better prospects for personal survival than remaining neutral in a conflict that would inevitably produce winners and losers. His background in commercial competition had taught him to recognize situations where compromise was impossible, and decisive action became necessary for self-preservation. Yet even his pragmatic approach failed to anticipate the scale of violence that his compliance would unleash. The massacre that began on September 2nd, 1856, forever destroyed the unity that had sustained their movement through struggle against overwhelming odds. Xu Qing and his immediate supporters were killed in their residences before they organized resistance, while their extended families and political associates were hunted down and executed to prevent future revenge attempts. The scale of this purge exceeded anything that even the harshest critics had thought possible, from figures who claimed to represent divine justice and humanitarian reform. Qin Rigung's involvement in the initial murders sealed his own fate when the prophet's paranoia expanded to encompass anyone who had participated in the violence, regardless of their motivation or intended loyalty. The logic of political murder, once unleashed, proved impossible to control, as suspicion bred suspicion, and fear generated preventive strikes against potential threats. Within weeks, the command structure that had taken time to develop was decimated by internal violence that accomplished what Qing resistance had been unable to achieve. Wei Changhui's own execution demonstrated the ultimate futility of attempting to use assassination as a tool for resolving political disputes within rebel movements. The Prophet's decision to eliminate the man who had eliminated his rivals reflected recognition that anyone capable of committing such acts posed inherent threats to future stability. Yet this logic, carried to its conclusion, suggested that no one warranted complete trust, creating isolation that made effective governance nearly impossible. Xiuquan's escape from Tianjin, with substantial units, represented the final collapse of the centralized command structure that had enabled their remarkable achievements. His departure deprived the kingdom of its most capable remaining general, while demonstrating to potential supporters that even the most loyal figures no longer trusted their personal safety to the Prophet's judgment. This defection had immediate battlefield consequences, but also symbolic impact that undermined morale throughout rebel domains. The loss of experienced commanders had devastating effects on combat capabilities, at precisely the moment when Qing opposition was becoming more formidable and better organized. Units that had previously been commanded by veterans with extensive combat experience now found themselves led by inexperienced officers whose primary qualification was political reliability rather than tactical competence. This degradation of command quality inevitably translated into battlefield defeats that reversed territorial gains. Administrative capabilities that had enabled effective governance of vast domains similarly deteriorated as the purges eliminated officials who possessed the practical knowledge necessary for managing complex bureaucratic operations. Tax collection systems that had functioned smoothly under experienced administrators collapsed into chaos when political appointees attempted to implement policies they did not understand. These governmental failures created additional sources of popular discontent that weakened support for rebel rule. Economic production throughout rebel domains declined as workers and farmers lost confidence in the stability of policies that affected their daily lives. Communities that had invested energy in implementing communal economic arrangements began reverting to traditional practices that offered more predictable outcomes. Agricultural productivity dropped as peasants hoarded resources against uncertain futures, rather than contributing to collective efforts that might be abandoned without warning. Communication networks that had enabled coordination across continental distances became unreliable as local commanders lost confidence in orders emanating from figures they no longer trusted. Units began operating independently rather than implementing strategic plans that required cooperation with other formations. This fragmentation of command made concentrated resistance to Qing advances difficult to organize and sustain. Spiritual unity that had provided psychological foundation for their movement fractured as believers struggled to understand how figures who claimed divine guidance engaged in such destructive internal conflicts. Many concluded that either their doctrinal system was fundamentally flawed or their guides had been deceiving them about their spiritual qualifications. Either interpretation undermined the faith that had motivated extraordinary sacrifices during struggle. By 1857, the movement that had seemed poised for ultimate victory just 4 periods earlier was fighting for its survival against enemies who had learned to exploit every weakness that internal divisions had created. Domains that had been conquered through brilliant campaigns were being abandoned as demoralized defenders retreated towards strongholds they hoped might prove more defensible. The dream of establishing God's kingdom on earth was dissolving into nightmares of mutual destruction and political collapse. The prophet's retreat into even deeper isolation reflected his recognition that the violence he had authorized to preserve his position had instead undermined every foundation upon which that position rested. Surrounded by guards whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned, served by officials whose competence was questionable but whose subservience was absolute, he found himself ruling over domains that existed more in his imagination than in practical reality. The irony was devastating and complete. A movement that had begun with visions of universal brotherhood had destroyed itself through fraternal violence. Figures who had promised to establish divine justice on earth had created hells of mutual suspicion and preventive murder. Rebels who had proclaimed their intention to save humanity from demonic oppression had become demons themselves, consuming their own cause from within, while their enemies watched in amazement. Yet even in this darkest hour, when everything seemed lost and every achievement appeared destined for reversal, seeds of eventual recovery were being planted by survivors who refused to abandon their faith in possibilities that had originally inspired their rebellion. The internal catastrophe that had nearly destroyed their movement would ultimately teach lessons about power, trust, and command that might enable future rebuilding efforts to avoid the mistakes that had proven so costly. The blood that had stained the floors of the heavenly palace would serve as reminder that even the most noble causes were vulnerable to corruption by human ambition and fear. The lesson was written in characters too red to ignore. Movements that consumed their own guides would inevitably consume themselves, leaving nothing but cautionary tales for future generations who might dream of transforming the world through violence and righteousness. From his modest study in Changsha, Zheng Guofan watched smoke rising from burning villages across the Hunan countryside and felt satisfaction rather than sorrow. Each column of black smoke represented another god worshipping stronghold reduced to ash, another pocket of rebel resistance eliminated through patient application of superior strategy. Where others saw devastation, this scholarly official recognized the systematic destruction of an enemy that had once seemed invincible but now revealed fatal weaknesses that methodical pressure could exploit. Guofan possessed qualities that made him uniquely suited for the task of suppressing what had become the greatest internal threat to Qing survival. His Confucian education had instilled habits of careful analysis and long-term planning that enabled him to see patterns invisible to commanders focused on immediate tactical concerns. His experience in provincial administration had taught him how local conditions affected broader political developments, while his literary accomplishments provided credibility among educated elites whose support would prove essential for sustained resistance efforts. Most importantly, Guofan understood that defeating the god-worshipping movement required more than battlefield victories. It demanded the creation of alternative institutions that could address the legitimate grievances that had driven millions to embrace rebellion. The corrupt banner system and demoralized green standard units that had proven so ineffective against rebel fighters needed to be replaced with formations that combined professional competence with genuine commitment to defending established order. The Hunan army that emerged from Guofan's organizational genius represented a complete departure from traditional imperial practice. Instead of hereditary soldiers motivated primarily by pay, these new formations recruited fighters from local communities who possessed personal stakes in defending their homes and families. Training emphasized practical skills rather than ceremonial displays, while promotion was based on demonstrated competence in actual combat rather than political connections or purchased rank. Financial innovation proved as crucial as organizational reform in enabling effective resistance to rebel expansion. Traditional imperial revenue systems had been disrupted by warfare and corruption, leaving provincial governments without adequate resources for sustained operations. Guofan's implementation of the Xiuquan tax system created new sources of income that could fund professional formations while avoiding the resistance that conventional taxation had generated among already burdened populations. This internal tariff system levied charges on goods in transit rather than on property or production, making collection relatively simple while generating substantial revenues from commercial activities that had previously escaped systematic taxation. Merchants who had prospered during the chaos of civil war found themselves contributing to governmental efforts, whether they supported the dynasty or not. More importantly, this tax base expanded automatically as trade recovered, providing growing resources for expanding operations. The recruitment methods that Guofan employed reflected his sophisticated understanding of the psychological factors that motivated effective resistance. Rather than relying on conscription or financial incentives alone, he appealed to cultural loyalties and local patriotism that could sustain commitment through prolonged campaigns. Young men from established families were encouraged to view service as opportunities for personal advancement while defending their communities against foreign ideologies that threatened traditional values. Officer selection processes emphasized both technical competence and moral character, recognizing that effective command required trust and respect that could not be purchased or imposed through formal rank alone. Candidates underwent rigorous evaluation of their educational background, family connections, and personal behavior before being entrusted with positions that affected the lives of hundreds or thousands of subordinates. This careful screening process produced a professional officer corps whose capabilities far exceeded those of traditional imperial forces. Training programs developed for these new formations incorporated lessons learned from studying rebel tactics while adapting them to serve governmental rather than insurgent purposes. Small unit operations that emphasized flexibility and initiative replaced the rigid formations that had proven so vulnerable to God-worshipping innovations. Engineers received instruction in siege warfare techniques that could be used to reduce rebel strongholds, while cavalry units learned to match the mobility that had given rebel forces such significant advantages. Weapons procurement and production received systematic attention, as Guofan recognized that technological parity was essential for battlefield success against enemies who had demonstrated superior equipment and techniques. Traditional armories were expanded and modernized to produce firearms that could match rebel capabilities, while foreign suppliers provided access to advanced weapons that domestic production could not yet achieve. Artillery units received particular emphasis, since concentrated firepower had proven decisive in reducing fortified positions. Intelligence gathering became a systematic science under Guofan's direction, with networks of informants and analysts providing detailed information about rebel capabilities, political developments, and economic conditions throughout insurgent domains. Merchants, refugees, prisoners, and defectors were systematically debriefed to extract useful information, while specialized agents operated undercover in rebel communities to gather intelligence that conventional sources could not provide. Communication systems linking scattered units to central command enabled coordination of operations across vast geographic areas that had previously been impossible to manage effectively. Signal fires, mounted messengers, and standardized reporting procedures ensured that tactical developments in distant regions could be rapidly communicated to headquarters for strategic evaluation. This coordination capability allowed Guofan to concentrate superior force at decisive points, while preventing rebels from exploiting the isolation that had characterized earlier governmental responses. The strategic approach that Guofan developed for combating rebel expansion differed fundamentally from the direct assault methods that had proven so costly for earlier imperial efforts. Instead of attempting to recapture rebel strongholds through frontal attacks that played to insurgent strengths, his forces focused on gradually constricting rebel-controlled areas through systematic occupation of surrounding territories and disruption of supply lines that sustained rebel operations. This patient approach required discipline and long-term commitment that professional units could maintain, but that earlier formations had lacked. Operations might continue for months or even seasons before achieving decisive results, demanding logistical capabilities and morale factors that only well-organized forces could sustain. The psychological pressure generated by gradual encirclement often proved more effective than direct violence in convincing rebel communities to surrender or negotiate. Economic warfare became an integral component of Guofan's strategy, as he recognized that rebel strength depended heavily on resources extracted from territories under their control. Trade embargoes prevented commercial activities that provided revenue for insurgent operations, while systematic destruction of agricultural infrastructure eliminated food sources that sustained rebel populations. These measures inflicted hardship on civilian populations, but proved effective in weakening rebel capabilities over time. Propaganda efforts complemented physical pressure by exploiting the ideological contradictions and internal divisions that had become apparent within rebel movements following their massacre. Publications distributed throughout contested areas emphasized the violence and chaos that had characterized rebel governance, while promising restoration of order and prosperity under legitimate governmental rule. Former rebels who had defected provided testimonial evidence about conditions within insurgent territories that contradicted rebel recruitment promises. The role of foreign powers in these developing conflicts became a crucial factor that influenced strategic calculations on both sides. European nations that had initially viewed rebel success with some sympathy began recognizing that their commercial interests would be better served by stability under established governmental structures, rather than continued chaos under insurgent rule. Diplomatic pressure and limited material support gradually shifted in favor of imperial forces. Charles Gordon's ever-victorious army represented the most direct form of foreign military assistance provided to governmental forces during this period. This mercenary formation, though small in absolute numbers, possessed technological advantages and professional training that made it disproportionately effective against rebel units that had not yet adapted to foreign military techniques. More importantly, its success demonstrated that rebel forces were not invincible when confronted by properly equipped and trained opponents. Meanwhile, rebel domains were experiencing the full consequences of their internal catastrophe as administrative capabilities continued deteriorating and popular support eroded throughout territories they had once controlled with confidence. The assassination of experienced commanders had left units without effective guidance, while the paranoia that had motivated the purges continued generating suspicion and fear that prevented the development of new cadres. Economic conditions within rebel areas reflected the breakdown of governmental institutions that had originally provided alternatives to imperial misrule. Tax collection systems had collapsed into arbitrary extraction that often exceeded the burdens imposed by traditional governance, while the communal economic arrangements that had initially attracted support proved impossible to maintain without competent administration and popular cooperation. Religious unity that had provided the ideological foundation for rebel solidarity fractured as believers struggled to reconcile the violence and chaos they witnessed with the promises of divine justice and earthly paradise that had motivated their original commitment. Many concluded that their spiritual guides had been deceiving them or had lost divine favor, leading to defections that weakened both military capabilities and popular support. The Northern Expedition, that had represented the rebels' most ambitious attempt to eliminate imperial resistance through direct assault on Beijing, ended in disaster as extended supply lines proved vulnerable to harassment, while units operating far from their base areas lost cohesion and effectiveness. Survivors who managed to retreat to rebel strongholds brought reports of organizational breakdown and declining morale that further undermined confidence in rebel prospects. Urban populations in rebel-controlled cities began expressing open dissatisfaction with conditions that had deteriorated markedly since the initial period of rebel rule. Food shortages, arbitrary taxation, and fear of violence had replaced the liberation and prosperity that rebel propagandists had promised. Secret communications with imperial forces became common as residents sought alternatives to continued insurgent governance. Foreign observers who had previously been impressed by rebel innovations and military effectiveness were now reporting evidence of systemic failure that suggested imminent collapse. Diplomatic correspondence flowing back to European capitals noted declining discipline, administrative confusion, and popular discontent that indicated rebel strength had been seriously weakened by internal conflicts and external pressure. The Second Opium War that erupted during this period created additional complications for both sides, as British and French forces occupied parts of northern China while pursuing their own strategic objectives. Imperial resources that might have been devoted to suppressing domestic insurgency were diverted to dealing with foreign invasion, while rebel forces attempted unsuccessfully to exploit these distractions for their own advantage. Yet the foreign conflict also demonstrated the technological and organizational superiority of Western military methods that both Chinese sides would need to adopt if they hoped to achieve lasting success. The rapid defeat of imperial forces by relatively small European expeditions provided sobering lessons about the inadequacy of traditional military approaches in an era of rapidly advancing military technology. Guofan's forces proved more adaptable to these new realities than rebel units that had become isolated and demoralized by their internal conflicts. His systematic study of foreign military techniques enabled him to incorporate useful innovations while maintaining the cultural foundations that provided his forces with popular support and institutional stability. By 1860, the strategic balance that had favored rebel expansion during the earlier phases of conflict had shifted decisively in favor of imperial forces that had learned to exploit every weakness that rebel success had created. Systematic pressure applied through professional units operating according to coordinated strategic plans was gradually reducing the territorial base that had sustained insurgent operations for nearly a decade. The ring of imperial forces that was slowly tightening around rebel strongholds represented the culmination of organizational and strategic innovations that had transformed the character of Chinese military practice. Professional formations operating according to modern principles were systematically eliminating insurgent resistance that had once seemed capable of overthrowing an empire. Yet even as military success appeared increasingly likely, Guofan understood that lasting victory would require more than battlefield achievements. The social and economic conditions that had made rebellion attractive to millions of people needed to be addressed through reforms that could prevent future insurgent movements from exploiting similar grievances. The challenge of governing a unified China after suppressing domestic rebellion would test imperial capabilities in ways that military conquest alone could not resolve. Standing on the walls of recovered cities, surveying territories that had been reclaimed from rebel control, imperial commanders could observe the systematic destruction of what had once been the most serious threat to Qing survival. Yet they also recognized that the empire that emerged from this conflict would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed before rebel challenge forced innovation and adaptation. The methods developed for suppressing internal rebellion had created new forms of military and political organization that would influence Chinese development for generations. Regional commanders who had gained experience in independent operations possessed capabilities and ambitions that might prove difficult to control once immediate threats had been eliminated. The price of victory might include transformations that would reshape imperial institutions in ways that no one could fully anticipate. The empire was indeed striking back with devastating effectiveness, but the China that would emerge from this struggle would bear little resemblance to the traditional order that rebels had originally challenged. Innovation, forced by necessity, had created new realities that would define the possibilities and limitations of Chinese political development for decades to come. Hope arrived in Tianjin, wearing the familiar face of family, but carrying unfamiliar ideas that would prove as dangerous as any enemy assault. Hong Rengan stepped through the gates of the heavenly capital in 1859. The Heavenly King's cousin, whose decades of exile in foreign territories had filled his mind with visions of railways, telegraphs, and constitutional government that seemed to offer salvation for a kingdom drowning in its own blood. Rengan possessed qualities that his cousin had lost during the dark period following the Great Purge, where the prophet had retreated into theological isolation and paranoid suspicion. Rengan radiated confidence born of practical experience in the modern world beyond China's borders. His time in British territories had exposed him to technological marvels and governmental innovations that could potentially transform their struggling domain into a power capable of competing with any nation on Earth. The younger cousin brought with him detailed plans for modernization that reflected sophisticated understanding of how Western nations had achieved their remarkable prosperity and military effectiveness. Steam-powered factories would replace traditional handicraft production, generating wealth that could fund expanded armies equipped with the latest weapons. Telegraph lines would enable instantaneous communication across their territories, solving the coordination problems that had plagued their administration since territorial expansion began. Most ambitiously, Rengan proposed constitutional reforms that would limit arbitrary power while establishing systematic procedures for governance that could prevent the kind of internal violence that had nearly destroyed their cause. Democratic elements borrowed from British and American models would provide channels for popular participation while maintaining the theological framework that justified their challenge to Qing legitimacy. These reforms would demonstrate to foreign observers that their kingdom deserved recognition and support from progressive nations. Yet even as Rengan outlined these promising possibilities, the practical situation confronting their kingdom had deteriorated beyond anything that institutional reforms alone might remedy. Qing forces under Zheng Guofan's direction had tightened their grip around revolutionary strongholds with methodical precision that demonstrated superior organization and resources. The gradual strangulation of trade routes and agricultural areas was generating shortages that no amount of administrative efficiency would resolve. Economic conditions within Tianjin itself reflected the broader crisis that threatened their survival. Food prices had risen beyond the reach of ordinary families as surrounding countryside fell under imperial control, while the flow of tribute and taxation from distant provinces had dwindled to levels that could not sustain basic governmental functions. The communal economic arrangements that had initially attracted popular support had collapsed into arbitrary requisition that generated resentment rather than cooperation. Religious enthusiasm that had once provided psychological foundation for extraordinary sacrifice was being eroded by practical disappointments and theological doubts that multiplied as conditions worsened. Believers who had expected divine intervention to ensure victory found themselves confronting evidence that suggested either their cause had lost heavenly favor or their spiritual guides had been deceiving them about their divine qualifications. The prophet himself had become a liability rather than an asset to the kingdom he had created through his visions and determination. His public appearances revealed a man consumed by paranoia and religious delusion, who was increasingly disconnected from the practical realities facing his followers. Proclamations that emerged from the heavenly palace demonstrated theological sophistication, but provided no guidance for addressing the urgent challenges that threatened immediate survival. Administrative chaos throughout revolutionary domains reflected the continuing consequences of the purges that had eliminated experienced officials while creating an atmosphere of fear that prevented effective replacement of lost expertise. Tax collection had degenerated into predatory extraction that often exceeded the burdens imposed by traditional governmental governance, while justice was dispensed according to arbitrary decisions that respected neither established precedent nor consistent principle. Communication between the capital and distant regions had become so unreliable that local commanders often operated for months without receiving orders or guidance from central authorities. This isolation forced autonomous decision-making that sometimes contradicted broader strategic plans, while creating opportunities for ambitious individuals to establish independent power bases that might eventually challenge central control. Despite these mounting difficulties, Rengan's arrival generated renewed optimism among those who believed that competent administration and foreign-inspired reforms might yet salvage their revolutionary experiment. His appointment to high governmental position demonstrated that the prophet retained enough judgment to recognize the need for practical expertise while maintaining theological authority over spiritual matters. The modernization programs that Rengan attempted to implement faced enormous obstacles created by resource shortages, popular suspicion, and enemy pressure that prevented the kind of long-term planning that systematic reform required. Telegraph construction proved impossible when copper wire could not be obtained and technical expertise was unavailable, while industrial development seemed absurd when territories were being systematically devastated by ongoing warfare. Educational reforms that might have generated support among progressive elements in their population were overwhelmed by immediate survival needs that made long-term investment in human development appear irrelevant. Schools that attempted to teach modern subjects found themselves without qualified instructors, adequate materials, or students whose families could spare them from more urgent economic activities. Military innovations that Rengan proposed might have improved their defensive capabilities if resources and time had been available for systematic implementation. Modern weapons and tactics required training periods and supply networks that their shrinking kingdom could no longer provide, while the demoralization that had infected their armed forces made discipline and coordination increasingly difficult to maintain. Foreign diplomatic initiatives that Rengan pursued in hopes of gaining international recognition and assistance encountered skepticism from European powers that had concluded their commercial interests would be better served by stability under established governmental authority. The violence and chaos that had characterized revolutionary administration convinced foreign observers that these insurgents lacked the institutional capacity necessary for effective governance. Meanwhile, government forces were implementing their own innovations that reflected lessons learned from earlier difficulties, while incorporating foreign expertise that provided significant advantages over increasingly isolated insurgent units. Li Hongzhang's modernization efforts had created formations that combined traditional Chinese organizational methods with Western technology and tactical doctrines that proved devastatingly effective against enemies who could not match their resources or training. Gordon's continued involvement with government forces provided access to artillery techniques and siege warfare methods that could reduce revolutionary fortifications more efficiently than traditional approaches. His professional competence and foreign perspective enabled innovations that purely Chinese commanders might not have attempted, while his international connections provided diplomatic advantages that reinforced dynastic legitimacy. The systematic approach that Qing commanders employed for reducing insurgent strongholds demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both engineering and psychological warfare. Instead of relying on costly direct assaults that might fail despite enormous casualties, they constructed networks of fortifications that gradually constricted revolutionary areas while providing secure bases for sustained operations. This patient strategy required resources and coordination that only well-organized forces with reliable supply systems could maintain, but it proved far more effective than dramatic gestures that had characterized earlier phases of the conflict. Month by month, the territory under revolutionary control shrank as government forces occupied strategic positions that made continued resistance difficult to sustain. Civilian populations trapped within these contracting areas faced impossible choices between continued loyalty to a cause that seemed doomed and collaboration with enemies who offered safety at the price of betraying former comrades. These moral dilemmas generated social tensions that added to the political and economic pressures threatening insurgent cohesion. The siege of Tianjin, that began in earnest during 1862, represented the culmination of strategic innovations that had been developing throughout the government counteroffensive. Instead of attempting direct assault against formidable urban defenses, Qing forces established a complete blockade that prevented supplies, reinforcements, or communications from reaching the revolutionary capital, while gradually tightening pressure through systematic occupation of surrounding territory. Engineering works that supported this siege operation demonstrated capabilities that rivaled the most advanced European military practices. Fortified lines stretching for dozens of miles around the city provided secure positions from which artillery could bombard rebel defenses, while preventing any possibility of relief expeditions breaking through to assist the defenders. Supply systems that sustained these formations through multiple seasons of operations required logistical expertise that traditional Chinese armies had never possessed. Psychological pressure generated by this systematic encirclement proved as devastating as physical hardship in undermining insurgent morale and popular support. The sight of government banners advancing steadily closer to their walls, while no relief appeared from their own forces, convinced many defenders that continued resistance was futile, regardless of their personal commitment to the cause. Within Tianjin itself, conditions deteriorated rapidly, as the blockade eliminated sources of food, medicine, and other necessities that urban populations required for survival. Rationing systems that had initially maintained some semblance of equity collapsed into desperate competition for dwindling resources, while disease spread through overcrowded areas where sanitation had broken down completely. Social order that had been maintained through shared commitment to revolutionary ideals disintegrated as survival became the primary concern for most inhabitants. Criminal organizations emerged to control distribution of scarce goods, while violence became commonplace as individuals and families struggled to obtain resources necessary for continued existence. The Prophet's response to these mounting crises revealed the complete breakdown of his connection to practical reality. Instead of developing strategies for addressing immediate threats, He issued proclamations declaring that divine intervention would soon eliminate all enemies while providing miraculous abundance for faithful believers. These theological fantasies provided no guidance for desperate followers who needed practical solutions to urgent problems. Religious observances that had once united communities in shared purpose became hollow rituals that many participants attended only because abandoning them entirely might attract attention from authorities who still possessed power to punish perceived disloyalty. The spiritual enthusiasm that had sustained extraordinary sacrifice during earlier phases of their struggle had evaporated under pressure of circumstances that seemed to contradict every promise their faith had offered. Administrative functions that were essential for maintaining even minimal governmental services had largely ceased as officials fled, died, or simply abandoned responsibilities they could no longer fulfill effectively. Tax collection had become impossible when most economic activity had stopped, while law enforcement had degenerated into arbitrary violence that often victimized loyal citizens while failing to prevent genuine criminal activities. By early 1864, the situation within Tianjin had become desperate, beyond any possibility of salvation through conventional means. Food shortages had reached levels that forced residents to consume materials that could barely sustain life, while medical supplies were completely exhausted, and disease was claiming victims faster than bodies could be disposed of properly. The prophet's own physical and mental condition reflected the broader collapse of everything he had created through his visions and determination. Witnesses described a man who had retreated so completely into religious delusion that he was incapable of recognizing the reality of his situation or providing meaningful guidance to followers who still looked to him for leadership. His death in June 1864, whether through illness, poisoning, or deliberate starvation, in the belief that divine sustenance would replace earthly food, eliminated the last symbol of unity that might have enabled continued resistance. With their spiritual guide gone and their cause obviously doomed, defenders began seeking opportunities for surrender or escape that might preserve their lives even if their revolutionary dreams were destroyed. The final assault that began in July demonstrated that government forces had learned to coordinate multiple approaches simultaneously while maintaining discipline and efficiency that maximized their advantages over demoralized opponents. Artillery bombardment that had been precisely targeted to create specific breaches in defensive walls enabled infantry assault units to penetrate urban areas while minimizing their own casualties. Street fighting that followed the initial breakthrough revealed the complete collapse of organized resistance as defenders either fled, surrendered, or died in futile attempts to protect positions that could not be held against overwhelming superior force. The systematic destruction that government forces inflicted on insurgent strongholds demonstrated their determination to eliminate every trace of the movement that had threatened dynastic survival. The massacre that accompanied Tianjin's fall exceeded even the violent standards that had characterized this brutal conflict throughout its duration. Government commanders who had been frustrated by prolonged siege warfare allowed their troops to exact revenge for casualties and hardships endured during the campaign. The civilian population that had supported revolutionary rule paid a terrible price for their loyalty to a cause that could no longer protect them. When silence finally returned to the heavenly capital, it marked the end of humanity's most ambitious attempt to create paradise on earth through revolutionary violence and religious transformation. The buildings that had housed governmental institutions dedicated to implementing radical social reform were reduced to smoking ruins, while the libraries that had preserved innovative theological and political literature were scattered ash that the wind carried away. Yet even in this moment of apparent total victory, Qing commanders understood that their success had come at enormous cost that would influence Chinese development for generations. The methods required to suppress domestic rebellion had created new forms of organization that might prove as dangerous to traditional authority as the insurgency they had defeated. The regional armies that had proven so effective against rebel forces possessed capabilities and loyalties that might not transfer easily to peacetime governance under centralized imperial control. Commanders who had gained experience in independent operations possessed ambitions and resources that could challenge traditional hierarchies if they chose to pursue autonomous paths. The kingdom of heaven on earth had fallen, but the earth itself had been transformed by the struggle. Nothing would ever be quite the same again in the Middle Kingdom, where the blood of millions had watered seeds of change that would continue growing long after the revolutionaries who planted them had turned to dust. Silence settled over the charred ruins of Tianjin, like dust after a great storm. But beneath that deceptive calm lay devastation so complete that historians would struggle for generations to comprehend its true scope. 20 million souls, perhaps 30 million. The records were too fragmentary and blood-soaked to permit certainty, had perished in humanity's deadliest civil war. Entire provinces had been depopulated, ancient cities reduced to empty shells, and cultural treasures accumulated over millennia scattered like autumn leaves before the wind of violence. The methodology behind these staggering death tolls revealed the systematic nature of destruction that had consumed the Middle Kingdom for 14 years. Population censuses conducted before the uprising showed flourishing communities that simply vanished from subsequent records, their inhabitants either killed in battle, executed during purges, or dead from starvation and disease that followed in warfare's wake. The Yangtze River Valley, once the empire's most prosperous heartland, resembled a wasteland where wild animals roamed through abandoned villages and weeds grew in fields that had fed millions. Demographic catastrophe extended far beyond immediate battlefield casualties to encompass the broader social collapse that prolonged warfare had generated throughout affected regions. Traditional family structures that had provided stability for countless generations were shattered as parents lost children, wives lost husbands, and entire lineages disappeared without trace. Marriage patterns were disrupted for decades as gender imbalances created by differential mortality rates made normal social reproduction impossible in many areas. Economic devastation reflected not only the immediate costs of warfare, but also the systematic destruction of infrastructure and productive capacity that both sides had employed as strategic weapons. Irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for centuries lay in ruins, their careful engineering destroyed by armies that understood water control as a tool of victory. Commercial networks that had linked distant regions in mutually beneficial exchange were severed by violence and suspicion that made long-distance trade too dangerous to attempt. Agricultural productivity throughout the affected regions dropped to levels that could barely sustain survival, let alone generate the surpluses necessary for economic recovery and population growth. Fields that had been battlegrounds remained contaminated with corpses and debris, while the complex knowledge systems required for intensive cultivation had been lost when experienced farmers were killed or displaced. Recovery would require not just peace, but also the patient reconstruction of technical expertise that had been accumulated over many generations. Cultural losses proved as significant as material destruction, though their impact would only become fully apparent in subsequent decades. Libraries that had preserved classical literature, historical records, and local traditions were burned by armies on both sides who viewed written materials as potential sources of enemy propaganda. Schools that had maintained educational continuity for centuries closed when their teachers fled or died, breaking chains of intellectual transmission that had connected each generation with accumulated wisdom of their ancestors. Artistic and architectural heritage suffered similarly devastating losses, as beautiful buildings were converted to warfare purposes, stripped for materials, or simply destroyed during urban combat. Temple complexes that had housed priceless sculptures and paintings for hundreds of years became rubble-strewn ruins where only broken foundations marked former magnificence. Musical traditions, craft techniques, and oral literature disappeared when the communities that had sustained them were scattered or eliminated entirely. Yet even as contemporary observers surveyed this landscape of unprecedented destruction, they could detect the emergence of new realities that would fundamentally reshape civilization in the Middle Kingdom for generations to come. The Qing dynasty had survived its greatest challenge, but victory had required innovations that transformed the nature of governance and created precedents that would influence development throughout the modern era. Regional militarization represented perhaps the most significant and dangerous legacy of the anti-insurgent campaigns that had proven necessary for governmental survival. The Hunan Army, Anhui Army, and similar formations that had demonstrated such effectiveness against God. Worshipping forces possessed organizational capabilities, financial resources, and popular loyalties that made them potentially independent actors rather than merely instruments of central authority. Zheng Guofan, Li Hongzhang, and other commanders who had gained experience leading these regional formations understood that their success had created personal power bases that could support autonomous agendas if circumstances made such independence desirable or necessary. Their control over taxation systems, recruitment, and local administration gave them practical sovereignty within their spheres of influence that traditional governors had never possessed. This pattern of regional strongmen commanding personal armies while maintaining nominal allegiance to central authority would prove characteristic of governance for the next century. The warlord era that dominated the early Republican period had its roots in the necessities that had forced the Qing court to delegate unprecedented authority to provincial commanders during their struggle for survival against domestic insurgency. Financial innovations that had been developed to fund anti-insurgent operations similarly created new realities that would influence governmental practice long after immediate needs had been satisfied. The Xiuquan tax system that had provided reliable revenue streams for regional armies became a permanent feature of fiscal policy, generating income that enabled governmental functions while creating economic distortions that affected commercial development patterns. More significantly, the precedent of local taxation funding regional forces established the principle that provincial authorities could raise their own resources rather than depending entirely on allocations from Beijing. This fiscal autonomy provided the foundation for the independence that regional commanders would assert as central authority, weakened during the final decades of Qing rule. Modernization that had been forced by the necessity of matching insurgent capabilities continued developing after the immediate threat had been eliminated, creating institutional changes that would shape culture throughout the transition to modern statehood. Professional officer training, standardized equipment procurement, and systematic strategic planning became normal features of organization rather than emergency responses to crisis situations. Western advisors and technological innovations that had proven crucial for governmental victory established patterns of international involvement in development that would characterize the country's modernization efforts well into the 20th century. The precedent of hiring experts from abroad, purchasing equipment from overseas, and adapting organizational methods had been firmly established through practical necessity rather than theoretical preference. The impact on later insurgent movements proved complex and multifaceted, as subsequent rebels both learned from God, worshipping successes, and sought to avoid their devastating failures. The organizational techniques, propaganda methods, and strategic innovations that had enabled remarkable territorial expansion provided models for future leaders, while the internal violence and administrative breakdown that had destroyed the movement from within offered sobering cautionary lessons. Mao Zedong and other communist leaders explicitly acknowledged their debt to this historical precedent, while claiming to have solved the problems that had proven fatal to their predecessors. The emphasis on party discipline, ideological unity, and systematic organization that characterized 20th century movements reflected conscious efforts to avoid the personal rivalries and theological disputes that had torn apart the Heavenly Kingdom's leadership structure. Popular rebellion, as a legitimate response to governmental oppression, had been validated through this example, even though the specific movement had ultimately failed. The demonstration that peasant armies could defeat professional troops, that alternative governmental institutions could be established, and that radical social reforms could be implemented, provided inspiration for generations of rebels who sought to complete the transformation that their predecessors had begun. Religious and ideological syncretism that had enabled the movement to appeal to diverse constituencies became a characteristic feature of subsequent organizing efforts. The ability to combine ideas from abroad with traditional cultural elements, to appeal simultaneously to practical grievances and spiritual aspirations, and to create new forms of social organization that addressed contemporary needs, while respecting historical continuity, became standard techniques for innovation. International recognition of this precedent influenced perceptions of capabilities and weaknesses in ways that affected diplomatic relationships throughout the modern era. European powers that had initially been impressed by insurgent effectiveness, while skeptical of their governmental competence, developed more nuanced understandings of potential that influenced their strategic calculations during subsequent crises. The demonstration that internal conflicts could generate violence on scales that affected global economic and stability convinced governments abroad that they could not remain completely neutral in domestic affairs. The precedent of limited international intervention that had been established through Gordon's ever-victorious army created expectations and precedents that would influence involvement in affairs for decades. Missionary activities were profoundly affected by the experiment that had attempted to create a kingdom through violent overthrow of traditional authority. The spectacle of converts using biblical imagery to justify mass killing and social upheaval generated skepticism about the wisdom of aggressive evangelization efforts, while demonstrating the unpredictable consequences that could follow from introducing ideas from abroad into local cultural contexts. The memory of enthusiasm gone wrong influenced both domestic and international approaches to Christianity throughout the late Qing and early Republican periods. Intellectuals who had initially been attracted to ideas from the West became more cautious about their implications, while missionaries developed more sophisticated strategies for presenting their message in ways that would not trigger similar explosions. Educational innovations that had been pioneered during the period continued developing after the movement had been destroyed, contributing to the gradual transformation of intellectual culture that characterized the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The emphasis on practical literacy, technical education, and gender equality in schooling became permanent features of educational reform movements, despite their association with failed upheaval. Women's liberation movements in modern times drew conscious inspiration from this precedent, while seeking to avoid the violence and chaos that had accompanied earlier efforts at gender reform. The demonstration that women could serve effectively as soldiers, administrators, and leaders, provided powerful arguments for subsequent feminists, while the ultimate failure of the experiment highlighted the difficulties involved in implementing radical social change. Literature and historical interpretation of the period reflected changing perspectives as successive governments sought to incorporate this traumatic experience into their national narratives. Late Qing officials emphasized the destruction and chaos that violence had generated, while minimizing the legitimate grievances that had motivated popular support for the movement. Republican historians who opposed Qing rule were more sympathetic to goals while remaining critical of methods and outcomes. The portrayal of the movement as a patriotic uprising against Manchu domination became a standard theme in nationalist historiography that sought to establish precedents for anti-imperial resistance. Communist interpretations emphasized this precedent as an early stage in the inevitable progress towards socialist transformation, while criticizing the movement's ideology and inadequate class consciousness. The attempt to claim continuity with this historical precedent, while distinguishing communist goals and methods from their predecessors' failures, became a recurring theme in official historical scholarship. Contemporary archaeological investigation of sites associated with the period has provided new evidence about the scope and character of the social transformation that was attempted during those tumultuous years. Excavations at former administrative centers have revealed the sophistication of governmental institutions that were established while confirming the systematic destruction that followed collapse. Material culture studies based on artifacts recovered from sites have illuminated daily life during this period of radical experimentation, while documenting the practical difficulties that undermined idealistic reforms. Evidence about economic organization, family structure, and technological innovation provides insights into both the achievements and limitations of the experiment. Modern movements continue to grapple with the complex legacy of this historical precedent, seeking to learn appropriate lessons while avoiding repetition of earlier mistakes. The tension between idealism and practical governance, between inspiration from abroad and cultural authenticity, and between radical change and social stability that characterized the original movement remains relevant to contemporary development. International scholarship on the period has evolved from viewing it primarily as a curiosity or aberration in history to recognizing it as a crucial stage in the global development of modern movements. Comparative studies that examine similarities and differences between this experience and uprisings in other countries have enhanced understanding of the universal patterns and unique features that characterize popular movements against established authority. The ultimate lesson, written in the blood of millions, remains as relevant today as it was a century and a half ago. The attempt to create heaven on earth through human effort alone, no matter how well-intentioned or courageously pursued, carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Yet the dream itself, the vision of radical transformation that motivated such extraordinary sacrifice, continues to inspire those who believe that a better world is possible, if only the right methods can be discovered and the right lessons learned. In quiet corners of the modern nation, elderly people still remember stories passed down through family traditions about ancestors who lived through those terrible and wonderful years when the kingdom of heaven seemed within reach and the world itself appeared to be turning upside down. Their memories, fragmentary and often contradictory, preserve echoes of hopes and fears that shaped civilization in ways that historians are still struggling to understand completely. The experiment had failed, but the questions it raised about power, justice, tradition, and change would continue challenging thinkers and leaders for generations to come. The ashes of the heavenly kingdom would fertilize intellectual soil from which new movements would grow, each hoping to avoid the failures while achieving the dreams that had motivated their predecessors' sacrifices. In the end, perhaps this was the movement's greatest legacy, not the achievement of its specific goals, but the demonstration that ordinary people possessed the capacity to envision radical alternatives to existing reality and the courage to risk everything in pursuit of their vision. That example, terrible and inspiring in equal measure, would echo through history long after the last smoke had cleared from the ruins of their attempted paradise.